Imagine standing in the blazing heart of the Sahara. The air itself seems to shimmer, as though the desert is on fire. A caravan stretches across the horizon, hundreds of camels, each carrying heavy slabs of a pale crystalline mineral. Not gold, not silver, not jewels, but salt. Traders march in silence, their faces veiled against the sand, their eyes fixed on the horizon. For them, this white treasure is worth risking death by thirst, ambush, or exhaustion. Why? Because without salt, their world collapses. Centuries before refrigeration, before freezers and supply chains, salt was the only way to preserve life itself. Salt kept meat edible, fish transportable, and grain stores from spoiling. Salt fueled armies, determined the rise of cities, and became the foundation of wealth. In Rome, soldiers were once paid in salt, giving us the word salary. In Africa, slabs of salt were exchanged ounce for ounce with gold. And in China, imperial dynasties financed their bureaucracies with state monopolies on salt. This is the story of salt, the mineral that was once more valuable than gold, and whose hidden empire shaped civilizations from the Sahara to Rome. It is a story of caravans and conquests, of merchants and monarchs, of wealth and survival. It is a story of how something we now take for granted, a seasoning sprinkled casually on fries or pasta, once determined the fate of nations. And yet, salt is not just a historical curiosity. It reveals something enduring about power itself, that the foundations of empire often rest not on luxuries, but on necessities. Gold dazzles the eye, but salt sustained life. Tonight, we peel back the forgotten pages of history. From the salt mines of Tagaza to the bustling markets of Timbuktu, from the Roman salt roads to the imperial courts of China, we will uncover how this humble mineral financed kingdoms, toppled rulers, and left an invisible mark on the modern world. Welcome to the hidden empire of salt. To understand why salt once rivaled gold, we must first strip it back to its essence: survival. The human body cannot live without salt. Sodium regulates nerve impulses, muscle contractions, and hydration. In societies dependent on farming, where diets centered on grains like rice, millet, or wheat, salt was not optional. It was vital. Farmers sweating under the sun lost salt by the bucket. Soldiers marching on campaigns could not endure without it. Even animals needed it, and herders carved salt blocks to feed their cattle and camels. This necessity transformed salt from a seasoning into a foundation of civilization. Unlike gold or silver, which symbolized wealth, salt was wealth in practice. Without it, food spoiled. Without it, armies starved. Without it, cities could not grow. Salt was not simply a luxury. It was security. Ancient Egypt recognized this early. Tomb paintings show fishermen salting their catch to carry inland, far from the Nile. In Mesopotamia, tablets record salt rations for workers, a recognition that labor productivity was tied to this mineral. Across the globe, salt mines became the beating heart of empires. Mines in China's Sichuan Basin, saline springs in Austria, and brine wells in India all show early civilizations mastering ways to secure salt supplies. But scarcity turned salt into power. Unlike rivers or forests, salt was not evenly distributed. Regions with deposits became strategic prizes. Salt deserts, marshes, and rock beds were often controlled by rulers who recognized that whoever owned the salt owned the people. Rome took this to extremes. The famous Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the first great Roman highways built to bring salt from the coast into the city. This was not merely about food, it was about empire. Roman legions, famed for their discipline, marched with salted meats and fish in their packs. In fact, Rome's system of paying soldiers a salarium, a salt allowance, is the root of the modern word salary. In other words, wages themselves were once tied to salt. By the Middle Ages, this truth would echo in Africa, where caravans carried salt across the Sahara, traded pound for pound with gold. The idea seems absurd to modernize, salt and gold as equals, but in a world where life could not be preserved without it, salt was survival incarnate. Thus, salt became more than a mineral. It became leverage. Kings taxed it, merchants guarded it, wars were fought over it. And across continents, it quietly financed the rise of kingdoms that might otherwise have remained footnotes in history. This is why when we look at ancient maps, the great highways, the centers of trade, and the fortunes of empires, we often find salt at the center. It is the hidden current beneath the tides of history. The Sahara may look like a barren sea of sand, but for centuries, it was the stage of one of history's most extraordinary economic dramas. Beneath its harsh surface lay the source of a mineral more precious than gold: salt. In the medieval world, West Africa's wealth was legendary. Empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai became the crossroads of trade, controlling routes that linked the riches of sub-Saharan Africa with the markets of North Africa and beyond. Gold flowed from the mines of Bambouk and Wangara, but its true twin was salt, hewn from the desert itself. Take the mines of Tagahaza in present-day Mali. Here, laborers carved massive slabs of salt from the desert floor, stacking them into loads that camels would bear northward. To outsiders, these blocks might have looked unremarkable, dull, heavy, ordinary. But to merchants and kings, they were white treasure. Caravans of thousands of camels set out across the Sahara, each laden with salt, enduring blistering days and freezing nights. Along the way, the desert demanded its price. Countless men and animals perished in the endless dunes. Yet still they came, because the rewards were beyond imagination. In Timbuktu, Gao, and other trading hubs, salt slabs were exchanged pound for pound with gold. The logic was simple. You cannot eat gold, but you cannot live without salt. For the markets of the savannah, salt was life itself, preserving food, sustaining herds, and symbolizing wealth. It was not only consumed, but also displayed, a marker of status in homes and courts. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, and often called the richest man who ever lived, ruled over this salt-gold nexus. His empire, AS Power, rested not only on gold mines, but also on his control of salt routes across the Sahara. When he journeyed to Mecca in 1324, his caravan dazzled the world with its gold, but its foundations lay in the white slabs carved from Tagaza and Taoudeni. Without salt, Mali's wealth would have crumbled. The significance of this trade went beyond economics. Salt caravans connected cultures. They carried not just minerals, but also ideas. Islam spread southward along these routes, shaping the spiritual and political life of West Africa. Scholars traveled with merchants, manuscripts with camels, prayer with trade. Salt was the artery through which knowledge, faith, and wealth circulated, binding the Sahara into a living network of exchange. By the time European explorers arrived on Africa's coasts, they were astonished to find kingdoms as rich and organized as their own, and salt was at the heart of it. The Sahara's white gold had financed armies, built cities, and sustained empires. Thus, while gold may glitter in memory, salt was the true foundation of West Africa's greatness. It was the invisible currency of survival, prosperity, and power. If Africa's deserts gave the world white gold, Rome turned salt into an institution of empire. From its earliest days, Rome recognized salt as more than a commodity. It was infrastructure, power, and order. One of the first great Roman roads, the Via Salaria, literally means the salt road. Built to carry salt from the Adriatic coast into the heart of Italy, it was not simply a trade route, but a lifeline for the city itself. Salt preserved Rome's fish and meats, kept its food stores safe, and supplied the legions that marched across Europe and beyond. The connection between salt and soldiers was so strong that it shaped language itself. The Roman practice of giving soldiers a salarium, literally a salt allowance, is the origin of the word salary. Wages and salt became intertwined, a reminder that even empire builders could not escape the mineral's grip. To be worth your salt was not a metaphor. It was an economic truth. Salt also underpinned Rome's administration. The state controlled salt works and taxed its distribution, ensuring both revenue and loyalty. This gave salt a double weight. It was at once food security and fiscal backbone. Controlling salt meant controlling life, which is why disputes over salt supply often sparked unrest. Consider Ostia, Rome's great port. Beyond its role in grain imports from Egypt, Ostia was also a hub for salt. Salt pans stretched along the coast, and barges carried the mineral inland. From there, it reached bakeries, markets, and army camps. Salt was not merely part of Rome's diet. It was embedded in the arteries of the city, as vital as aqueducts or roads. But salt's influence extended into culture as well. Roman religion used salt in sacred rites, mixing it with flour to purify sacrifices. In everyday life, no Roman household could function without it. Thus, salt was not just economic but spiritual, a link between survival, prosperity, and the gods themselves. Yet Rome's salt economy also carried a warning. Just as West African kingdoms guarded their mines, Rome's enemies understood that cutting off salt supplies could weaken the empire. Salt was a pressure point, a reminder that empires, no matter how mighty, are built on fragile foundations. The Roman obsession with roads, taxation, and military logistics was in many ways an obsession with salt. For in the end, even the grandeur of the Colosseum and the Senate rested on something deceptively small: white crystals drawn from marshes and sea. If Rome made salt the lifeblood of empire, China transformed it into a tool of governance itself. For thousands of years, dynasties rose and fell in part on their ability to control salt. China's geography gave it abundant sources: coastal evaporation ponds, inland salt lakes, and brine wells. But unlike in Rome, where salt circulated through private and state-controlled channels, in China salt became a monopoly of the state. Beginning as early as the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, emperors recognized that salt was too important to be left to merchants alone. By seizing control of salt production and distribution, they created one of history's earliest and most enduring state monopolies. Why salt? Because it was universal. Every household, from peasant farmers to palace officials, depended on it. Taxing land or crops was subject to the whims of weather and harvest, but salt was steady. By regulating its price and production, the Chinese state secured a reliable revenue stream that could fund armies, pay officials, and maintain the vast bureaucratic machinery of empire. This monopoly was not just economic but political. The government appointed yanyun, salt transporters, and established fixed regions for production. Merchants could profit, but only within state-controlled frameworks. In some periods, licenses to trade salt were given to loyal families, turning the salt trade into a network of patronage and power. In others, smuggling became rampant, a silent resistance against the state's grip. Entire communities along rivers and coasts lived in tension with imperial salt officials, their livelihoods tied to a mineral they did not truly own. Salt also shaped China's innovations. The world's earliest known drilled wells, reaching hundreds of feet deep, were built not for water but for brine extraction in Sichuan. The brine was then boiled using natural gas, another Chinese first, to produce crystalline salt. This technological leap not only sustained populations but also exemplified how salt drove invention. Philosophers and historians took note. In the 4th century BCE, the statesman Guanzhong declared that the people cannot do without salt, urging rulers to guard it carefully. Centuries later, reformers like Wang Anshi, 11th century, saw salt monopolies as both a lifeline for the state and a burden on the poor. The debates over salt taxes became debates over justice, governance, and the balance between ruler and ruled. By the Ming Dynasty, The salt monopoly was so entrenched that it accounted for a substantial portion of imperial revenue. Yet it also bred corruption. Officials enriched themselves, merchants exploited loopholes, and peasants bore the cost. The irony was stark. The very mineral that sustained life also sustained inequality. Salt, then, was not just a flavor in China. It was governance crystallized. It linked the emperor's authority to the peasant's table, creating a chain of dependency that defined Chinese statecraft for 2 millennia. If deserts and roads made salt empires on land, the sea created salt kingdoms of its own. Salt and water were inseparable, not just because of production, but because salt preserved the food that made seafaring possible. Without salted fish and meats, long voyages would have been unthinkable. In this way, salt didn't just fuel armies, it fueled exploration, discovery, and conquest. Take Venice. This maritime republic rose to power not only through its strategic ports, but also through its dominance in salt. Venetian merchants controlled routes from the Adriatic salt pans to markets across the Mediterranean. By monopolizing supply, Venice secured both wealth and leverage over rivals. In fact, salt was so central to its power that wars, known as the Salt Wars, were fought between Venice and neighboring states like Ferrara, with salt serving as both weapon and prize. Further west, Portugal and Spain built their Atlantic empires with salt as a quiet companion. The Portuguese salted cod, bacalhau, became a staple, fueling sailors on journeys to Africa, India, and the Americas. The Spanish relied on salt for fleets carrying silver from the New World. Salted provisions allowed empires to project power across oceans. No salt, no empire. Salt also tied into the slave trade. In West Africa, European traders exchanged salt alongside guns and textiles for enslaved people. These captives were then shipped across the Atlantic on voyages sustained by salted food. Here, salt reveals its darkest face. The mineral that preserved life also preserved a system of human exploitation and suffering. By the 17th century, salt had become global. Dutch traders established salt works in the Caribbean, French colonists in Guadeloupe and Martinique, and British merchants in North America. Salt not only crossed borders, but shaped them, embedding itself in the arteries of global capitalism. Thus, as sails rose across oceans and ports thrived with commerce, salt was always present, invisible yet indispensable. It did not sparkle like gold or silver, but without it, the modern world would never have been born.